Welcome to this explainer. Today, we're unpacking one of the most fascinating historical mysteries of the American presidency. We're looking at a guy whose legacy has completely shapeshifted over the last century. Yep, I'm talking about Ulysses S. Grant. Now, you might think you already know the history of the post-Civil War era, but let me tell you, the way the story of the specific leader evolves is truly captivating. Here's a crazy question for you. Did you know that for a really long time, historians ranked Grant among America's absolute worst presidents? Yeah, let that sink in for a moment. It's almost hard to believe today, but for decades, that was just the established, unquestioned truth in the history textbooks sitting in classrooms all across the country. And this brilliantly illustrates the massive contradiction here. On one side, you have the victorious general, the resolute leader who helped win the Civil War and basically preserve the Union when it was literally on the brink of total collapse. Yet somehow, in public memory, he became a failed president, totally bogged down by scandals. So how exactly does the savior of a nation become a historical villain? Let's look at Part 1, the myth of failure. Why exactly was he catching so much criticism? Well, for generations, history just hyper-focused on the negatives of his administration. We're talking about the whiskey ring scandal, corruption among his closest cabinet members, and the really heavy economic fallout from the Panic of 1873. His political opponents were incredibly successful at pinning the era's worst mistakes entirely on him. And that created this flattened, highly simplified narrative that completely erased his monumental triumphs from the public consciousness. Okay, let's dive into this next section. Part 2, Scholars Take Another Look. By the late 20th century, a totally new generation of historians, including modern biographers like Ron Chernow, decided to basically reopen the cold case on Grant. They bypassed those old textbooks and went straight to the primary sources, examining old letters, digging deep into forgotten government records, searching through fading newspaper archives. They went looking for the actual truth buried beneath decades of assumptions. And what they discovered in those dusty boxes completely upended the old narrative. Which brings us to Part 3, Protecting Civil Rights. So those archives revealed monumental achievements that had been essentially ignored during his lifetime and long after, too. During Reconstruction, Grant actively fought to protect the civil rights of formerly enslaved Americans. And he didn't just use words, he created the Department of Justice and used federal power, like the Ku Klux Klan Act of 1871, to crush violent extremist groups that were actively threatening democracy. He also fiercely championed the 15th Amendment, expanding voting rights for millions of citizens. These are massive, foundational actions that absolutely shatter that failed president myth. Moving right along to Part 4, A Legacy Redefined. Because of these incredible archival discoveries, the old narrative just crumbled entirely. Books were actively rewritten and new biographies corrected the record. As one modern biographer put it, Grant was one of the most misunderstood leaders in American history. So, the crucial point is, scholars aren't claiming he was a perfect man or a flawless president. He definitely wasn't. But he was a leader who navigated one of the most violently turbulent periods in American history, taking bold actions that the history books simply forgot to credit him for. And his personal journey of perseverance, it is almost unbelievable. This is a man who repeatedly faced massive failure, setbacks, criticism, and really intense hardship. At one point, he was a struggling clerk in a Galena leather shop, barely making ends meet. Yet, when the fractured nation needed him most, he rose to become a victorious general, a national hero, and ultimately, against all odds, a two-term president of the United States. It's truly one of the most remarkable stories of sheer determination on record. It brings us to a really profound realization about how we study the past. The story is never truly finished. New evidence constantly appears. Old assumptions are constantly being questioned. Great leaders are rarely fully understood in their own time, and it can take well over a century for the truth to finally catch up. Sometimes, history just needs a second look. Which leaves us with this. If a figure as massive as Ulysses S. Grant, the man who won the Civil War and served 2 terms as president, could be so deeply misunderstood for nearly a century, who else does history need to take a second look at? What other forgotten truths are just waiting in the archives to be discovered? It certainly makes you want to keep questioning the history you think you know.